Go.
All right.
Hit it.
Go for it.
All right, so everybody's here for Flexbox, right? Okay.
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
Well, you know, I had that happen one time at DrupalCorn. I was talking to somebody, sitting there after session. They got ready to go. I was like, oh, this is where I want to be. So I'm assuming you guys are all front-end people, designers, or at least do some of that stuff. Probably not coding away deep in core. All right. Any of you guys freelancers or independent? Small shops? Just me, huh? Okay. Well, I'm a freelancer. My name's Scott Wilkinson. I'm from Kansas City. Been freelancing on my own for about the last 10 years. And I've been working with Drupal pretty much that whole time almost. Well, about 8 years probably. So you find me on IRC or Drupal.org at HaloFX, on Twitter at HackMonkey with 3. Is anybody in here, everybody got an idea what Flexbox is? No idea? Anybody else, no idea? No idea? Okay, that's cool, that's good. All right. So have you guys played around with it at all? Did you kind of got an idea if it's for layout? Yes. You do?
No idea.
You guys are just here because you didn't have anything else to do, right?
That's right.
No, well,
No, we
we didn't know. We were like,
this is the best.
Okay, well, good. Great. The future is here. That's right. So, if you like, I've been building sites since about 1995, 1996. And when I first got started, I mean, it was like Cello was the web browser. There was no Mosaic. We were dialing up on 2400 baud modems using Trumpet WinSocket and Windows 3.11. But when I saw the internet, and it's like, oh, this is amazing. My actual first exposure was in college on a fax terminal. There was no web at the time. It was like the ability to interact with people around the world was just mesmerizing. And once the web came along and I saw the code, even though I was in art school and designer, I've always been kind of nerdy, but once I saw code, it was like, I can read that. I can figure that out, you know. It's not too hard. But that's how we were doing layout. That's awful. You know, that's how you lay out tabular data. They were never designed for layout. And then we got doing stuff like this, which is really nasty. Clear pixel GIFs. Anybody build a site using clear pixel GIFs for spacing? Yeah, we did. I used to do it a lot. Although I'm very proud to say that when I went to write this slide, I actually had to look up this information because I could not remember how to do it. So that is from my memory. Then a little bit later, late 90s, moving into 2000s, CSS came along, and that gave us some more display options like inline block, table, display none. We've all used that one, right? Absolute positioning, floats, and margins, and negative margins. And that gave us more options for layout. And we abused them. And we used them to put things in places that they were never designed to be used for. But finally, after about 6 years, CS3 spec started to come around, and it's been trickling out in little pieces. And as part of the CS3 spec was Flexbox, a display property that was actually designed for layout. So Flexbox has been in development for about 6 years. And for all these things, they come out and it's like, we can't use that. It's not supported, it's not supported, it's not supported. Well, it is supported now. And as of last week, when I took this screenshot, 93.99% of the world's browsers, everybody but IE9, and 8. Anybody in here supporting IE8? Please tell me no. Anybody in here worrying?
you probably do.
Anybody like really seriously worrying about IE9?
We probably do at our shop because a lot of our clients are like farmers.
Yeah. You know what my answer for that is when a client tells me that we have to support IE9? Add a 0. And then we don't worry about IE9. But it does happen. I looked at some of the sites that I built, and most of my sites were right around this 1.5% site usage. I have one site, which is a large community site devoted to automobiles that has a larger an older non-tech savvy audience. It was 4.5.
Wow.
but 4.5%. And then when I dug into what those people were doing, most of them were bounces. And this site is coded from about 6 years ago, so I know it's not because they can't see the site. So really, there's no reason why we can't start using Flexbox today. So like I said, it's been in development for about 6 years. It was first supported in about 2009, clear back to Chrome 4, and so Firefox 2. To me, that's like ancient times. I can't even remember that far back what it was like. And the display, and it's undergone a lot of changes since then. So there's three syntaxes that you'll encounter when you're looking through things, if you're searching around on the internet. The first one is the very first spec, which is display box. And if you encounter anything like that, ignore it. None of the browsers support that for the last like 4 years, 5 years. You can just pretty much discount that when that's defunct. Then the next one is what's commonly considered the tweener syntax, which will be display flex box. And that's been superseded, but it is worth keeping in mind because that is the version that IE10 supports. And we all should be worrying about IE10. Luckily, we don't have to worry a lot about IE10. It's come a long ways. It's not that bad of a browser. It's not my default, but it's not bad. And then the current version is display box. Or I'm sorry, display flex. We're not going backwards. And that the spec on it's been pretty stable since about 2012. They've been making some real minor little tweaks to it here and there. There actually was an update to the spec just last month now in July, but it was basically just clarifying some stuff in the spec. But this spec here is supported by all the major browsers right now. Back, let's see, to like Chrome 31, and what we're like on 36, 37 now. Firefox 22, we're well past that. And now we have IE Edge, and I've played around with IE Edge in Windows 10, and it supports it just fine as well.
I think it's 44.
Is it 44 on Chrome?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they've been there a while. So, because there are these three syntaxes out there floating around, and because of IE10 that we need to support, it's still really important that we use prefixes. So you don't want to write this, but this is what you need for maximum compatibility. So you really want to use a tool like AutoPrefixer. So you can use, if you're using like all the grunt, gulp, that kind of workflows, you can do that. I'm not that guy either. So, but you can use tools like CodeKit. There's another one called Prepros, stands for preprocessor. That is actually what I used when I built this presentation, because my presentation is built in Flexbox. It's just a little bitty app that runs, fires up a little local web server, you point it at a file directory, and it processes things and runs SAS and Compass stuff, and actually can use libsass to do it if you're familiar. Everybody here familiar with SAS, Compass, use it? Preprocessors on your CSS. It's pretty cool. But anyway, it will take care of this auto prefixing for you. It's a checkbox, puts it out for you. So shouldn't be worried there. So Flexbox works on the idea of a parent-child relationship. So you have the parent, which is called a flex container, and that contains children, which are called flex items. The flex container, is the wrapper, affects the flex children, the items. But children, the flex items, can also have their own set of attributes. So these are the default attributes that are on the flex container. And they only affect the direct children directly underneath of them. And you can nest Flexbox items inside of Flexbox items. If you put one flex container inside of a flex child inside of one, the flex container only affects its direct flex children. So if you put another one inside of there, you can do whatever you want inside of there. It's not like this where you use like M's in your fonts and they start stacking up and then your math and head blows up. So these are the defaults. If you just say display flex, boom, you get that. So the display flex is a property that just puts everything in motion. That's all you got to do. Display flex, everything takes off here. But there's actually two options for the display property. They both affect the children, the flex items, the same. The only real difference is that display flex makes the flex container act like a block, and inline flex makes it act like an inline block. I really haven't encountered any reason why I would ever want to use inline flex to make the container act like an inline block. And when I was doing my research and all the studying and all the articles, I've never seen anybody even use that in their documentation and their examples. So I'm not going to use it either because I've been able to accomplish everything that I wanted to accomplish without it. But it is worth in mind if you ever encounter a reason that you want your flex container to behave like an inline block, that's how you can do it. So here's some just real simple code. Everybody understands this, right? It's just a list, right? Okay, good. And we're going to use this to throw some code out and see some examples and see how Flexbox behaves. So by simply saying display flex, we automatically go from that to that. And that gives us the flex direction row as a default. And what that does is it introduces the idea of having a main access and a cross access. So if you're using a row, it's going to run across the main access, the row, vertically. And this is the default right here. And the main access by default runs left to right, and the cross access by default runs top to bottom. And then you have the idea of a flex direction column, which then stacks the items up in a column. And the directions of our accesses haven't changed, but the roles of the cross access and the main access have changed. So direction all sets which direction the main access is going to go. And that's really important because everything works off that main access, and then we make changes to that and affect it from there. So row reverse reverses them. And now the main access is still running horizontal, but now it's pointing to the left instead of the right. So row reverse on a column, same thing, top to bottom. So by default, Flexbox items don't wrap. But that's kind of one of the real awesome things about Flexbox is wrap. So by default, if you're using a row or a column, they're going to stack right up in one big long row or one tall column, even if they don't fit quite right. So here, I've made my content a little bit bigger, and you can see it's blowing out the side a little bit. By just saying wrap on the flex wrap property there, it automatically puts a wrap on things. And that introduces another concept that's important to think about with Flexbox, and that's the idea of a line. You can see the line there in the yellow. The line always runs parallel to the main axis. So now our items are starting at the top, going across, dropping down to the next line, still starting at the start of the main axis and moving across. And they're stacking in the order of the cross axis. Everybody got that? Any questions? I tend to talk a little fast sometimes, so if I talk too fast, yell at me. If you have any questions, please holler out. So just like we could reverse columns, we can reverse rows. So by reversing the row, we reverse the axis of the main axis. And now the things are still starting at the top, coming down, but now they're coming from right to left. Put a wrap reverse and a row reverse on there, and we reverse both of the main axes, and we start in the bottom right and move up to the top left. Cool? So columns, pretty much the same thing applies here. Without a wrap, blows out the bottom if there's too much content. Put a wrap on, and now they're going to wrap around, but because they're columns and stack, they're going to stack down, move the row over, running parallel to the main axis, and start another column down. Reverse the column, same deal. Now they go from the top to the bottom, but they're still following the cross axis from left to right. Then do a column reverse and a wrap reverse, start down the bottom right, go up, but now moving to the left. So flex flow is a shorthand method of putting all those values together. So you can just simply say flex flow or wrap, column no wrap, reverse wrap, whatever you need to do. And that's really when you're writing your CSS, this is the preferred way to write it. It's just a little more concise and to follow. All right, so everybody cool on the flex flows and the directions? Good. That's not the hardest part. So next value that applies to the parent flex container is justify content. And this is going to affect how the extra space on the main axis is used if the items don't fill up the full width. So the default is flex start, which means all the items come to the start of the main axis. So flex end moves them to the end of the main axis. And if you take a row reverse and throw it with the flex start, it still is at the start of the main axis, but now the main axis is turned around. So now they're coming back, it's either in reverse order now. So you want to pay attention to those. If you put one in, you put the other in, you're not expecting it to go the other direction. You want to make sure to remember which directions your axes are going. So consequently, center moves them to the center, takes the extra space, and what it's really doing is it's taking the extra space, dividing it in half, putting half on one side and half on the other side. So that if we have now space between as a justify content value, takes the space and divides it evenly, placing it between each of those flex items. If you were trying to do something like this without Flexbox, I mean, here we just wrote justify content space between. If you're trying to do this with columns, you'd be doing all the CSS and 10%, 20%, add the, you could do it, but it's ugly. It's a lot more work than this. This is super simple, and this will stretch to any size that we need. So we also have space around. And again, talking about the idea of spacing up the content, the space. It's taking the space and dividing it evenly between each side of an item now. So that the items on the end have half the space on the outside as the items in the center do between. That makes sense? Yeah. I mean, if you remember, if you were doing this other ways, you'd be doing all this crazy math and percentages, and this is so easy. So this isn't actually part of a Flexbox property, but it's a really cool trick that works in all the browsers. And again, it would be a ton of work to try to do any other way. If you take a margin and you apply a margin to the side of a flex item that has extra space, it will take all that space and stick it into that margin by using margin auto. So doing this any other way would be crazy because you'd have to do like absolute positioning and floats and all kinds of stuff and clears. And here you can just say margin auto and it's just going to do that. And if this were to expand and contract, that space would just move fluidly and the items would stay the same. Zoe Gellenwater did a real cool example of this where she had it laid out as a navigation item. So she had a logo in the center, and then each of the items on either side were navigational links. Trying to do that, put a logo in between, split a navigation, a menu in half, that's crazy. Here, this is just our list of 4 items. We haven't done anything to our markup. All right, so justify content, arrange the items on the main axis. Align items is our next value, and it controls how our items behave on the cross-axis. And the default that we've been seeing all along so far is stretch. So that's making these items stretch to fill the entire length of the cross-axis, which is one of the things that's really cool about Flexbox. You try to lay out stuff and you try to do like full height columns on something, that's crazy. You get all these JavaScript stuff, or you do, like what we used to do is we put a background image that had a different color on it and made it look like it was a column. Now we can actually do it. So the first one is align items, flex start. And that takes the items and it moves them to the start of the cross-axis. So Flex end takes the items and moves them to the bottom of the flex axis. And notice how the space is collapsing in on top of them. So center moves the line to the center of the cross axis, and then centers the items on the line. Combine the two, justify content center and align item center, and everything goes straight to the center. You ever try to design a site, you had to put something right in the middle of the page, and you're doing margins auto, body height, height 100%, width 100%, margins 100, boom, done.
Definitely makes the
And you could put this,
vertical
yeah, and you could put this inside of another container, and you could say, here's a container that's a quarter of the bottom of my page, and I want to put it right in the middle of the center. Boom, done. So another one, last one here is baseline. That's going to take all the items and it's going to arrange them along a common baseline. Consequently, this only works with rows. Columns don't have baselines. So, the next one is align content. And this controls how the space between the rows is used when you have a wrap. And again, the default is stretch. So it's taking the items and it's stretching the extra space between the two lines. If you notice, the top group is taller than the bottom group. But the space from the bottom of the 12 to the bottom and the bottom of the 2 and the top line to the bottom is the same. That's where it's putting the space between the actual lines. Because our lines aren't lining up the same, because they have more content on the top row than that one that has the 2 twos. So align content flex start moves the lines up to the start of the cross access. Again, that second one has more content in it, so it's moved down. End moves them to the end of the axis. And align content center moves the lines to the center of the cross axis. Space between is like we saw before and puts the space in between them. Space around does the same thing again. It takes the space and puts it around. When our top row is wider than our bottom row, the space above the top row and the space below the bottom row are the same, and the two of them together equal the space in the center. Because we're dealing with the extra space is what we're dividing, what we're distributing. So then you can combine align content and align items, set them both to center, and you can get something like this. You're centering the lines, and then you're centering the content on the lines. Make sense? Questions? Confused? It's a lot. I know. So here's an interesting one. We're combining align content flex start with align items flex end. And the first time I saw this, I thought this should be on the bottom. But what's actually happening here is align content is moving the lines to the top of the cross axis. And align items is putting the line on the bottom of the items. And here again, it's worth noting that if align items does nothing unless you wrap. All right, so that takes care of the container elements for the parent. The children have their own set of properties. Flex basis, flex grow, and flex shrink are probably the two hardest to understand how they work because they can be used by themselves, but they really usually want to get used together. So flex basis establishes the size that the item wants to be. The default is auto, which means it just inherits whatever the width attribute might be applied to it by something else, like another class, or whatever the content is. Flex basis can also take values And in many ways it works like the width attribute does. If we set it to 3M and everything fits, they'll be 3M. It could be 20 pixels, it could be 10%. As long as they fit, no problem, it's going to act like a width. FlexGrow controls the item's ability to grow if it doesn't fill the space. If there's extra space, we can tell it to grow. By default, though, it's 0, which means don't grow. But changing that value to 1 means that actually now you get 1 share of the free space. And if all the items have the same FlexGrow value, they each get an extra share of the free space, so they get evenly distributed in the width here. Values for FlexGrow are integers, and they're either 0 or positive numbers. Everybody understand how that works? Still, a big part of Flexbox is dealing with the empty space or too much space. See here in a second. So FlexGrow is also a ratio. So in this case, all the items have a basis of 3M, which means they all want to be 3Ms wide. The second item is the only one that has a FlexGrow value on it, so it gets all of the free space. Everything else remains 3Ms. That one moves. And if our design contracted, that would be the one that contracted, and if it grew, that would be the one that grew. The others would stay the same. So in this case here, we have a FlexGrow value on everything, and the second has a FlexGrow value of 2. So we take our extra space, we divide it by 5. We don't. Flexbox does. And it takes one of those 5 amounts of space and gives it to everything. The second item has a 2, so it gets a double helping of that extra space. It's not twice as wide, its space is twice as wide. Anybody here in the Mark Drummond's responsive images talk? The math here is so much easier than the math in that.
Yeah.
I did responsive images last year. This is a lot easier. It's a lot of items, but it's a lot easier math. So if there's no extra space to grow, then they just don't grow. So in this case, we're giving them all a FlexGrow value of 1 and telling them they want to be 500 pixels wide. We don't have 500 pixels. Even though the second one has a flex value of 2, there's no extra space to divvy up, so they don't do anything. They just all go even because they all inherently have a flex shrink value of 1. So flex shrink works on the same principle that flex grow works in reverse. The default's 1, so when items don't fit, they all shrink proportionately if they have the same value. If there's no extra space, it doesn't do anything because there's nothing to shrink. Like this case. They all fit, shrink doesn't do anything. But when all the values are too big to fit, in this case 500 pixels each, which would be twice the weight of our screen, it shrinks them. And they're all 1, so they all shrink proportionately of the extra space. Well, actually not necessarily in the extra space in this case. The whole thing does shrink proportionally. So in this case, all the items want to be 200 pixels wide, but they're not going to fit. The space, so we saw earlier that our the flex attribute at the top there on the list item is 0, 1, 40%. 0 grow, 1 shrink, 1 be, actually I got a different number in my notes. I said 40%, or 200 pixels, but it's actually 40%. So they all want to be wider than the screen. And they all have a 1, So they all, by default, are going to shrink the same amount. But since we've added on the flex shrink value of 2 for the second item, and a flex shrink value of 4 on the third item, that second item is going to shrink twice as fast as the outside items are, and then the third item is going to shrink 4 times faster than the outside items are. That makes sense? So, there's a shorthand for this as well. Just flex. Oh, actually, I said that a second ago. I hadn't got the slide. So, first value is flex grow. Second value is flex shrink. Third value is the basis. So, you can write them all quickly like that. If you do flex none, it's the same as writing flex 0 grow, 0 shrink, and auto, which means don't grow, don't shrink, just render the way you are, just like a block. And it would inherit any width attributes that were applied it from someplace else. That's the hard one. The easy one is order. So by default, all flex items have a value of 0, which means just render it the same way it shows up in the DOM. If we give a negative value or a smaller value than the other ones to an item, it moves up the main axis. If we give it a larger value, it moves down the main axis. So in this case, the one that should have been first is now last because it has the largest value of 1. 2 is holding on to its 0, so it just stays put. 4 and 5 have negative 2s, so they move to the left, but since they're the same, they go ahead and take on the order that they come in the DOM, which is 4, then 5. This is really handy when you're doing responsive layouts and you want to like have things shrink and then move around. So if you've got like a big aside, you know, on the left-hand side, and then you shrink it down, you don't want that big chunk to go up above your content. Put a negative value on your content, and your content will move up, and your aside will drop down below. To do that without Flexbox, you're doing the negative margins, you're doing floats. There's all kinds of ugliness. We can do it, but it's not this easy. I can count to 1. So, align self works basically the same way that align items did, except now instead of dealing with all the child items, you're dealing with one child item that you apply it to. The default value is auto, and it stretches. So we'll quickly run through these. So flex start moves the one item to the start. Flex end moves it to the end. Center puts it in the center. So that's the technical stuff. And it's a lot. But it gives you a lot of options to do a lot of crazy stuff. So now I'm going to try to get back. And we'll look at some examples of this stuff in use. All right. I have a 7 and a 9-year-old. Last August, we got a corgi puppy. No cat photos in my slides. Yeah?
But Mark said that the internet was for cat pictures.
For Mark's internet, it is. I'm a rebel. So, all right, so here we've taken a little gallery that we put together, and our markup is the same markup we've been using all the way along here, a list. I've taken display flex, put that on our list, told it to wrap, told each of our items that they can grow by a value of 1, don't shrink, try to be 150 pixels. And then, of course, I've done the auto on our responsive images there. So that lays them out all nice and pretty here. That out of the way. All right. So as we bring down our window, it's going to shrink them until it reaches another point that it can display them 150 pixels wide. And then it's going to shrink, shrink, shrink again until they all fit at 150 pixels wide. It goes the other way. They're going to shrink until they hit 150 pixels. Then they're going to drop back down and start growing again until they hit 150 pixels. Pretty cool. But you can do some weird stuff. May not be what you want in your design. So just need to be pay attention to what you're doing. You could also throw some extra content on here that said, you know, we could constrain that with a little bit of CSS, max size equals 150, and that one on the last item would shrink down. The opposite way, or another way of doing this, would be to reverse the values. So now, same markup. The only thing we've changed on our items is now we've changed it so don't grow, but do shrink. Try to be 150 pixels. So the interesting thing here is if you use a grow without a shrink, it works kind of like the idea of a minimum width. You're going to be at least 150 pixels, and you can grow out until you hit the spot where you can drop back down to 150 pixels. A shrink works the opposite. It's like a minimum width, or maximum width, I'm sorry, maximum width. So here, maximum width of 150 pixels, our images stay 150 pixels. Because if they get smaller, they just drop to another row. Because there's no grow value on there. Now this doesn't get so crazy. And because we have space around on that last line, the extra space is being applied to both sides, so that one's centered. That makes sense? One more here for these. So here we're back to grow, but this time we're using items that aren't all the same size, and there's some oddball shapes in there. And I've got my align items center, so they're all being aligned on the same line. And the lines are going to change distances as the items on the lines heights change. So our lines are jumping around as our content jumps around, but to make it all fit. Next one here is a layout. This is one of the things, you can use Flexbox for all kinds of things. But this is kind of like the holy grail that everybody's looking for here. You know, how can we do grids without doing all the crazy grid stuff? So in this case, we just got some real simple markup here. Header, main, footer, got some divs thrown inside of them. Nothing fancy being done to them. And we're using some media queries here. So our default, since we're using min widths here, is display flex, flex direction column. That's for the media queries, so that means, one more. Our content's just going to stack. That's what columns do. But our first media query here, at 480 pixels, takes just the header and turns it from a column into a row. So when we hit that point, that one wraps. And now they're displayed horizontally. Our next media query moves the main content area. Brings them down. Then our next one brings our footer out. And again, our flex stuff here, we're not even messing with grows. We're not messing with shrinks. Just swapping columns for rows. Because their default values are all stretch. That make sense? We can take that same markup, add 2 order items in there, and now we're at our large display. Looks just like it did before. We get down to the first breakpoint, footer, same deal, no problem. But when we wrap that main one, now that content jumps up, and those 2 sides are now down below it. Just by setting those order values. Now, the inclination is to actually write it in your DOM, in your markup, so that the content is first, followed by the two asides because you want content first, and then move that. And there's a way you could do that, but if you just took the first aside and you put a 1 on it, it would actually put the first aside behind the second aside, because, or actually no, I take it back. When you got to this point, the content would actually go over there, because it would now have the largest value. The largest value goes to the extreme. So you could put like a 1, then a 2, and then add them in there. And you could do it that way, but this way is the quickest, simplest, with the least amount of changes by just adding those two order values. And that's one of those things you just kind of play around with, you get a feel, whatever's going to work for you. Content first is good, but it's not always an option. Or the best option, I should say. So here we've got another flexible layout. This time we're not using any media queries. But we are using grows, shrinks, and bases. The header and the footer are both set to grow 1, shrink 1, 100% width. They're going to stay on their own row, they're going to shrink, they're going to grow, they're going to go wherever size they want to, but they're going to have their own row. Nothing's going to sit with them. The aside and the content, however, both have a shrink of 1, so they're going to shrink. But the main content area has a flex grow of 3, and the aside has a basis of 200 pixels, and the main area, the content, has a 400 pixel basis. So that means it wants to be twice as big as the other one, and then based on those grow and shrink values is how they're going to shrink, so it's always going to stay bigger. So when that comes down, they both shrink, but they shrink at a different rate until they hit that point at 600 pixels where they both can't sit, and it's going to wrap, and because it has a stretch value, it's going to stretch right back out. So our markup here is just simply header aside main footer. Put a flex value on the body, you're done. Really simple layout here. Forget divitus, the Drupal thing. Now we need to get them to code us some code up like this. That make sense? So you can do columns, you can do rows, you can take columns and put rows on the side of the columns, you can go whatever way you need, but you don't usually have to get too crazy because you can let Flexbox do the work for you by just adjusting those grows, shrinks, and bases. Here we've got an example of a navigation system. Default in its wide value, just like we always see stuff horizontally across, all stacked up. We've got some media queries on here. And we're changing here our bases and the flex values. So when this thing comes down, they're going to shrink until it hits that 500 pixel point where the text items are going to go from just being a 3 to wanting to have 50%. So when they wrap, they're going to take up half the space. When that keeps coming down, it's going to hit a second point, and now they're going to stack up on top of each other because they're still a row, but the row is wrapping. And those small little dots, which were social media icons from the Flex Awesome font library that I was pulling in off the internet until I realized the internet was so bad in here. And they became boxes. But at this point, you could take this, you could throw 5 lines of jQuery on here, shrink this thing up, and this now can become a drop-down navigation system. Another navigation system that we can have here is an off-screen menu. Usually this is done with a bunch of JavaScript and absolute positioning and all kinds of stuff like that. Well, with Flexbox, 4 lines. I'll show you how it works here real quick. So I hit that. The content area shrinks, lets the menu come out. Looks like it's over the top of it, but what's actually happening here is, see their markup there also. The whole thing is in a container that's marked display flex. The main element that has our content in it has a flex value of 1, so it can shrink or it can grow. No basis, do your thing. The navigation has a flex value of 0 for grow, 1 for shrink, and 0% for its basis. And on the main one, we hit, say, flex 1, that means grow 1, don't shrink, and 0. When you have a grow value with a 0, it means 100%. When you have a shrink with a 0, it means collapse. So when we have our menu checked nav item there, that second line where it says flex 015, now that's telling it, make this 5%. And because the main area is flexible, it just moves on. So we have this real nice hidden navigation system here that just slides out from the side with Flexbox and almost no code at all. No JavaScript, nothing on jQuery, nothing like that to fail. Don't have to worry about turn off JavaScript in their browser. Just can't have IE9. And this is using a trick called the menu checked, which works with these IDs and this label here to actually make the CSS property picked up the checked value to change the value on there. It's really not that hard, but it's kind of like a little weird deal. And I've actually, in my references links at the bottom, there's a link to the CSS tricks that shows you how to do that. It's actually really easy. Chris Coyer, CSS Tricks. Everybody familiar with CSS Tricks? That website? If you're doing front-end stuff, it's just like the holy grail of content and information. Everything ever done, they've got one of the best almanacs on all the CSS properties, all the values, CSS2, CSS3s, everything. And he's always putting up stuff to have guest posts. It's like my go-to place for any time I ever can't remember how something works or want to learn about it. So he put up this sample, which I totally ripped off from the URL that's on the screen. Just last week when I saw this, like, this is going in my demo. So we've got, take a look at our markup here. We've got an H3 tag that has a span wrapped around the main part of the title and a span wrapped around a sub part of the title that we want to spread out. Maybe across the top of the page is a header with a main title and a subtitle. Well, we could do that a couple different ways. You could do it with absolute positioning, you could do it with a float, or you could do it with Flexbox. But when they shrink, they behave very differently. So take a look at that. We'll see the absolute one goes absolute and runs right over the top of it. And the float floats down and clears, right? So it goes underneath of it. Well, Flexbox just wraps. And has a much more pleasing approach, even though you could say, okay, so the float one goes underneath of it, but it's kind of awkward right there. It kind of starts moving in weird, whereas the Flexbox one snaps. And the CSS to do that's pretty simple. We're just basically saying a row. This is the Flexbox. I just saying no wrap. The white space there, and a wrap. Whereas absolute positioning, we're putting absolute values. We got to put a right on there. We got to put a bottom on there to pull it up, and with the float, you've got to put a relative on the sub part, and you got to add top on it to move it around. So, if you have to worry about IE9. Smart browsers understand Flexbox. The dumb browser doesn't understand Flexbox. So we understand progressive enhancement. A browser renders what it understands and it ignores what it doesn't understand. Some layout values for positioning and floats, the browsers understand, and if they see Flexbox, they ignore. But I haven't found a lot of documentation to say exactly which ones do which. When I started experimenting, my experiments and results were pretty hit and miss. But if you use Modernizer, you can hit it every time. Does everybody know what Modernizer is? Not know what Modernizer is? All right. So Modernizer is a little JavaScript detection library that you can put in your page. It's real simple, little bitty thing. And all it does is, instead of doing browser detection, which we all know is bad, does feature detection. And what it does is it just asks the browser, do you understand what Flexbox is? And the browser says yeah or no. And if it says yes, it goes on. You can have it either go on its merry way, or it can put a class of Flexbox in the head. If it doesn't understand it, it puts no flex in the head. Or you can say just put flex or just put no flex. So once you have that extra class, now you can write CSS for both values. Normally, before, we would have used like conditional style sheets. You know, if you're IE, put in this style sheet. If you're not, put in this. Now you can just say, hey, is that class there? Okay, cool. Render this way, another way? Okay, so now instead of putting an absolute, turn that to a relative, take that space off and put down the flex, and boom, go. And this is pretty much the bulletproof way to do it. It's not really that hard. The biggest thing is just remembering which CSS values you're putting on and which values you're taking off. It's real easy to use. I'm not a coder. I use this. So, our previous demo, this is the absolute position markup and CSS. And the floated markup and CSS from our previous example, I've used Modernizer just to add some extra classes on there on top of those as a progressive enhancement. And, cross my fingers, this morning, it worked. So this would do what it would normally do in IE9, but in a Flexbox capable, well, it would work in a Flexbox capable browser the way it's supposed to work, and it would work the way it normally works with IE9, with your floats and your absolute position. So that's the content. Here's some references. That first one there, CS6 Tricks, Guide to Flexbox, that's kind of like the go-to. Like half the articles I'd read when I was studying up on Flexbox said, yeah, okay, here's how you do this thing, and go read this article, because that's how I learned it. That's really and CS Tricks has got some amazing stuff on it. The second one there with the checkbox hack tells you how to do, I did that little deal with the checkbox to make that behave. Philip Walton, his Solved by Flexbox site, has some great examples of common tasks that we run against when we're doing layout and how we can approach those with Flexbox. Zoe Gillenwater is doing some amazing stuff with Flexbox. She has put out some videos, she's put out some slide decks, she's been presenting some different conferences. I just got Smashing Magazine's 5 responsive design book, and she's got a chapter in there about Flexbox in there, which is just dynamite. Wes Voss has got a site called Flexbox.io that just launched recently, and he's got like 20 videos of different programs and samples and things that you can do with Flexbox, and shows you how to use it and whatnot. So there's tons of resources out there, but those 4 right there will get you a long way. So. Any questions?
Do you have your slides on the...
Yeah, I'll get them up there.
Okay.
I'll definitely get these links up there, because that's that CSS Tricks article. Actually, let's see here. I wonder if the internet will work. Just CSS Tricks, Flexbox, box, and it will be the first one. he's basically got kind of the same deal here. Like I put just all the little different, well, we'll go slower. All the different properties, parents on the left, children on the right. Just breaking down each one of them. He goes, it's a little more concise, but this is a real quick cheat sheet when you're working with Flexbox. How's that value work? What's it do? Which one side to go on? And I say, when I was doing my research, half the stuff is like, yeah, here it is. But I got my information from this site right here. And I got a lot of my information from this site. Any more questions? Everybody understands this is better than floats? Forget IE9. We don't need it. We have Flexbox. Yay! All right. Well, that's what I got.
Thank you.
Thanks.